All right, if you're with us for the first time, we started a brand new series last week called Tipping Point, and this is a sermon series coming from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, 20, and 21. Now, why this period of time is so critical in the life of Jesus is because it is exactly what the series of this title of this series says. It was a real tipping point in his ministry. There had been rumors and conversations going around among the people of Jerusalem, the religious leaders, the Romans, the common people, had all come to recognize that Jesus, this guy named Jesus from Nazareth, is doing some pretty remarkable things. I mean, he is restoring sight to the blind. He's causing the lame to be able to walk again. He has even raised the dead back to life. He is teaching these amazing things. And so there's never been anybody like him. There have been people who had come to Israel who had claimed to be the promised Messiah, this king who would come and restore the nation of Israel and save the people. But all of them ended up being martyred or killed by the Romans, and all their followers dispersed and nothing came of it. But Jesus was different. There was something about Jesus that captured everybody's attention. And as he's on his way back to Jerusalem, one of two things is going to happen. This whole thing is going to fall one way or the other. It is either going to fall towards the people of Jerusalem welcoming Jesus in as king and saying, yes, you are who you claim to be. You are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. You are the Savior of the world. Or they're going to say, no, he's a fraud, and they're going to reject Jesus as king. It's going to go one way or the other. Everybody's reaching that point. So as Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem, he's having these encounters where we're seeing people confronted with this reality. Who is Jesus? Now, the interesting thing about this is still true 2,000 years later. That when it comes to the teachings and the ministry of Jesus, we still come to this tipping point where at some point we're all going to have to say one way or the other, is Jesus who he claimed to be? Do we really believe that he is God who took on flesh and came to live among us, and that he has called us to submit and surrender ourselves to him and to make him the king of our lives, the king not just of the universe, which he already is, but to specifically make him king in our lives and in our families. So last week, as we started the series out, we met a very interesting guy. His name was Zacchaeus, and you may know him from the famous song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man and a... Okay, you know Zacchaeus too. So last week we looked at Zacchaeus, this guy who was the chief tax collector. He was a Jew, he was born a Jew, but he was hated and reviled by the Jews because he had sort of traded in his allegiance to God and his allegiance to his people to become a tax collector for the Romans. And then he had even risen to the point where he was chief tax collector, meaning he had other people underneath him. And so he hears that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's going to pass right through Jericho. A huge crowd has gathered, and it's such a big crowd that Zacchaeus can't see Jesus because he's short. He's a wee little man. But his height wasn't the real problem. His real problem was everybody hated him. So they weren't going to make way for Zacchaeus to get to the front of the line. So Zacchaeus climbed a tree. Jesus sees Zacchaeus, calls Zacchaeus down and says, hey, I am coming to your house today. To which all the crowd grumbled. Because how in the world could you go and be at this guy's house? Do you know who this guy is? Do you know what he has done? And the crowd, the religious crowd who had come to see Jesus and was pressing in to see Jesus, all criticized Jesus. And Jesus' response in verse 9 and 10 of Luke 19 was, today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus keeps going back to his mission. This is why I've come. This is what the king has come to do. The king has come to seek and to save the lost, and salvation has come to this guy's house today. Now, it was not only shocking for the crowd that Jesus would go to Zacchaeus' house, but for Jesus to declare that salvation had come to Zacchaeus was not only shocking, it had to be completely baffling to them. In fact, they were probably pretty angry about the fact that Jesus would declare that salvation has come to that. Because this guy had not kept the law. He had not done any of the right things from the religious perspective to deserve to have salvation. And Jesus has just said, salvation has come to your house today. And this led Jesus to tell one of his best known parables. But before we get into the parable, I have to give you a warning about this parable. Because you think you know this parable, but you don't know this parable. You know a parable from Matthew's gospel that is very similar to this parable. Now, let me give you a little insight. If you're new to church, you don't know much about the Bible, let me give you a little insight into the New Testament. We have at the beginning of the New Testament 4 Gospels, which are basically like biographies, collections of Jesus' teaching and all that he did of Jesus. And they're told by 4 different people. Now, if you were to go to the library and you were to start wanting to read on some historic figure, where there are many biographies written about them, say a past American president or some other historical figure, you would go and you could find biographies written by multiple people that would all tell the same story, but they might not have all the same details. They might tell things a little differently. They might interpret things a little differently. The 4 Gospels are similar to that, in that these are the inspired word of God to these gospel writers, but they each come at the life and teachings of Jesus a little differently. Now, not only that, but they all chose different things to put in their gospel account because they couldn't have put everything in. They had to choose how much was actually going to go in. So it is very probable that Jesus told the parables that we know many times as he's teaching. He's going from one village to another village, and he's teaching, he's telling these parables, and it's probably true that he told different versions of these parables based on the audience who was listening and the circumstances that were going on. But here's what we do. 2,000 years later, we sort of blend it all in together and just act like the parable that Jesus told from Matthew's gospel is the same as the parable Jesus told from Luke's gospel, but it's not. The parable from Matthew's gospel you know of as the parable of the talents. It's a very famous teaching of Jesus. You don't have to be a Christian to know it, but it's this idea that the master is going to leave and he entrusts 3 of his servants with different amounts of his wealth. I'm going to give this guy 5 talents, this guy 2, this guy 1. He goes away, he comes back, and you know the story. The first 2 guys invested, they doubled the money. That's good. The 3rd guy did nothing, he buried it, and he's kicked out. That's the parable. But when Luke shares his version of the parable, the version that Jesus told here in Jericho, he includes a lot of things that Matthew didn't include. And most of the reason you are more familiar with Matthew's version of this parable than Luke's is because Luke's has some really troubling parts of it. So we just kind of skip Luke's version and tell Matthew's version because it's a lot easier to understand Matthew's version than it is Luke's version. So people at Aspire, people come to Aspire, you all are like, you're above average. So we're going to tackle this, and I want you to understand a little bit more about what was going on historically because Jesus is talking to his audience, and they all picked up on some things that were happening politically around them, and they understood this parable to be very specific about what was about to happen and about what it meant. That they were all approaching a tipping point where they were going to have to decide who was going to be the Lord and Master, who was going to be the king of their life. So if you have a Bible, open with me to Luke 19, verse 11, and remember, this whole thing happens right after Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus. And the crowd just was grumbling because Jesus just said salvation has come to his house. So the crowd's grumbling, and so Luke carries on the story, and he says this, verse 11. As they heard these things, as they heard what things? Well, as they heard Jesus say, salvation is coming to Zacchaeus' house today. Like, I know he hasn't kept all the dietary laws, and he's betrayed you, and he's working for the Romans. None of that matters. Salvation has come to his house today. So as they heard these things, he proceeded to tell a parable. And then Luke tells us why he told the parable. Because he was near to Jerusalem, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. In other words, everybody's thinking, he's headed to Jerusalem. He's going in there to kick out the Romans. He is going to take charge. He is going to be the king. This is our guy. This is our guy right here. So they're all thinking that. They're really puzzled and even a little angry about Zacchaeus. And so that prompted Jesus to tell them this parable that he is about to tell, his disciples and all those who have gathered around. Now, Jesus' disciples also fully expected that Jesus was going to Jerusalem to be crowned the king. We're going to talk more about them next week as we continue through Luke chapter 19. But everybody in the room, everybody in the area is expecting that Jesus is getting ready to go to Jerusalem to be crowned king. He said, therefore, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. Calling 10 of his servants, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. Now already, those of you who are familiar with the parable of the talents from Matthew's gospel, you can hear some differences. In Luke's gospel, there are 10 servants, and they were all entrusted with a finite amount of money for an unknown amount of time. Every one of them, all 10 of these, were given the same amount, and it's just a limited amount of money and they have it for an unknown period of time. Now, if you go back to the parable of the talents in Matthew, you know that they were given the talent. And now, a talent is a sack of gold and silver equal to about 20 years' wages. So it's a lot of money. But a mina is only 100 days' wages. Now, that's still a lot of money. If you could imagine about a third of your salary, your take-home salary, that's what he gave each of these 10. But you also notice something different. In Matthew's version, there are 3 servants, all given different amounts. But in Luke's version, there are 10 servants, and they're all given exactly the same amount of money. But listen to what Jesus, this is totally different than the parable of the talents, because listen to what Jesus says next in Luke 19, verse 12. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, "We do not want this man to reign over us." When he returned, having received the kingdom, he ordered these servants to whom he had given the money to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. Now, this doesn't mean a lot to us because this history is 2,000 years old, but Jesus' audience, listening to this story, would have immediately been thinking about something that was going on in recent politics in the area of Jerusalem and Palestine in the Roman government. In fact, if this story would have brought to mind something as fresh to them as classified documents in presidents and former presidents' homes, okay? So I just want you, if you ever know, like you're in a situation and you're talking about something and there's a reference to something going on in culture, in politics, in art around you, everybody in the room kind of knows because we're all up on what's going on. Jesus is telling this parable about this master who was going away to be appointed as king, but they sent a delegation after to say, hey, we don't want that guy to be king, but he comes back and he is king. Everybody there would have immediately known that Jesus is making reference to something that went on in Palestine. Now, if you know the Christmas story, you know the villain of the Christmas story is a king named Herod the Great. Herod the Great was terrible. He's called Herod the Great because of all the things that he did, whether they were good or bad, but he's actually a pretty bad guy. You remember the story of the wise men. They go to Herod the Great and they say, hey, Herod says to them, hey, when you find this one who's born king of the Jews, come and tell me so that I can come and worship him too. But that wasn't Herod's intention. Herod wanted to see this potential king killed. He didn't want any threat to his power. See, Herod wasn't even really Jewish. He had just sort of seen the power vacuum, and he made his peace with Rome, and he bribed the right people, and he became the king of the Jews, but he was really a fake, and all the Jews knew it. He was hated. So after Mary, Joseph, and Jesus escaped from Bethlehem, Herod the Great came and he killed all the infant boys in that area under 2 years old. I mean, it was horrible what he did. But Herod the Great died. And that was at the point of the story where Joseph was visited by an angel and Mary and said, hey, you can go back. So he went back. Herod the Great's oldest son, Archelaus, wanted to be king in his father's place. The problem Archelaus had is that he could not become the king unless the Roman government agreed for him to be king. So after Herod the Great died, Archelaus, Herod the Great's oldest son, traveled to Rome to go and get the appointment from the Roman government to become the king of Israel in his father Herod the Great's place. But the Jews, who did not like Herod the Great, certainly didn't want his son Archelaus to be king. So they sent a delegation to follow Archelaus all the way to Rome, and they argued, please don't make this guy king. We don't want this guy to be king. But the Roman government didn't care what the Jews thought. They made Archelaus king anyway. So you can imagine when Archelaus came back, all those people who had gone to say, hey, we don't want him to be king, they were not on the good list. Okay? These were not people who were going to have influence or power in Archelaus's regime. And so Archelaus came back and he ruled Israel for 10 years as king. But he was hated and despised, and the Israelites were constantly, there was turmoil and controversy going on the whole time. And every 10 years, the king had to go back to Rome to be reappointed as king. So in 10 years, Archelaus went back to Rome, and the same delegation followed him back to Rome and said, please don't make him king. This time, because Archelaus had done a terrible job, he hadn't suppressed all the violence and the riots, Rome said, okay, you're not going to be king. Instead, we're going to make your younger brother, Herod Antipas, king in your place. And so Herod Antipas, who Herod the Great's younger son, became the king of Israel. Now, all the people listening to Jesus' parable would have immediately known, you are talking about a guy who went to go be appointed king, and a delegation went to follow him who didn't want him to be king. They immediately are recognizing you are talking about Archelaus. You are talking about what went on in our very recent history. So they all would have understood this is exactly what Jesus was talking about. His citizens hated him, and they sent a delegation after him saying, we do not want this man to be king over us. And when he returned and he was made king, he called all those people in to give an account. What were the servants' responsibilities to a man they did not want to be their king? Now, this is an important question. What is the responsibility of these 10 servants? And we don't know their opinion of their master. Luke doesn't tell us, Jesus doesn't tell us what their opinion is of their master. We just know that nobody in the town wants this guy to be king, so they send a delegation. So we can just assume that these 10 servants don't want their master to be the king. But the question is, what responsibility did they have to a man who would be king that they didn't want to be king? So listen to what happened. The first came before him saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. And he said to him, well done, good servant. Because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10, what's that next word? Cities. Now remember the parable of the talents, they just got more talents. But here what you're seeing is this man who would be king was testing his servants. He gave them all 1 mina each. He went away, and he was going to come back as king. And when he came back as king, he was going to determine, what did you do with the little bit of resource I gave you for the undefined amount of time I gave it to you? Because what you did with that will determine your authority when I come back as king. So when I come back as king, this guy took his mina and made 10 more. Great. Guess what? You're not just getting another 10 minas. You are going to be in charge of 10 cities in the kingdom because I am now king. So this is looking pretty good for that guy. The second guy came saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. And he said to him, and you are to be over 5 cities. So again, the king was testing the faithfulness of his servants to see who was fit to rule with him. Who was fit in the coming kingdom to rule and reign with him and have authority. Then another came saying, Lord, here is your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief, for I was afraid of you, because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit, and you reap what you did not sow. Now, this man probably had made a decision not to invest the money with the hope that when his master came back, his master wouldn't be king. Right? I mean, he is probably fully invested that there is no way that this guy is going to come back and actually be my king. So what I'll do is I'll just do the bare minimum of what's required of me. I'll at least not lose the mina he gave me. He gambled his master's directions against his desire, and he lost the bet. He gambled his responsibility with the little bit he had for the undefined amount of time he had it against his master who would come back as authority. He was gambling that his master would not be in charge when he got back, and he lost the bet. And so the master said to him, I will condemn you with your own words, you wicked servant. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit and reaping what I did not sow. Why then did you not put my money in the bank, and at my coming I might have collected it with interest? And he said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. And they said to him, but Lord, he already has 10 minas. I tell you that to everyone who has, he will be given more. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. But as for these enemies of mine, now listen to this. As for these enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. That's interesting, right? I mean, and this is why we prefer Matthew's version of this parable. Like, this version is so much more complicated. It's got so much more meaning to it. And I think Jesus probably, again, told this parable multiple times. But as he's telling it, as he's about to go into Jerusalem, knowing that everybody in that room is expecting him to become king, and what kind of king they're expecting, Jesus is telling this parable for a very different reason. And let me just share a few things with you about this parable, a few principles that I think really speak to us today and that lead us, each one of us, 2,000 years later, to the same tipping point that the audience who first heard this parable came to. First of all, you have been entrusted with a finite treasure for an indefinite time. Every single one of you. You've been entrusted with a finite treasure. Doesn't matter how much it is. You might say, well, my bank account's in the red, or I've got plenty of savings and I'm set for the rest of my life. Whichever way you are, you have been entrusted with a finite treasure. It's measurable for an indefinite amount of time because you don't know how long you're going to have it. You don't know how long you're going to live. You don't know how long it's going to last. You don't know what the economy's going to do. And when we talk about treasure, we're not just talking about money. We are talking about everything that has been entrusted to you. The talent that you have, the education that you've been given, the relationships you have, the career that you've been given, the people that you know. You have been entrusted with a finite amount of time, treasure, influence, relationships. You've been entrusted with that finite amount of treasure for an indefinite amount of time. You have no idea how long it will be there. We only know about 3 of these servants who came back to the master. Did you catch that? Remember, how many servants did the master give minas to? 10, right? He gave 1 mina to 10 servants each. But did you notice that in this parable, Jesus only tells you about 3 of them? Meaning that if you were listening to the parable, if you're listening to Jesus, you're like, hey, Jesus, what about the other 7? What did they do? To which Jesus said, I don't know. What will you do? Right? Because I think we're the other 7. We're the other 7 servants. What are we going to do with the finite treasure that we've been given for an indefinite period of time? Jesus left this unresolved because he wanted us to feel the tension of the question, what will we do? Because Jesus has left and he has said he will return as king. And this time there won't be any denial. Like there were a lot of confusion the first time Jesus came because let's face it, he came in a very unusual way for a king to come. He came born of a virgin, laid in a feeding trough. He never had a great wealth, never had great power influence. The first time he came, a lot of people questioned it, but Jesus said, I'm going to come back as king. And the question is, what are you and I doing with the finite treasure that he's entrusted to us for an indefinite period of time? Which leads me to the second thing I think this parable teaches us. And that is how you invest your time and treasure reveals your loyalty to the king who entrusted you with them. What you do with the resources you've been given, whether it's financial, whether it is relational, whether it's educational, whether it's experiential, what you do with the finite amount of treasure you've been given will reveal the loyalty, your loyalty, to the king who entrusted you with them. Everything you have has been given to you by God, whether you choose to obey him or not. Whether you choose to believe him or not, whether you choose to crown Jesus as king or not, everything you have has been entrusted to you by God. And what you do with it is a revelation of the loyalty you have to who you believe gave it to you. See, there's nothing that you own that didn't come to you from God. And you might be here today or listening to this message today and you're an atheist. You don't even know if you believe in God. You certainly don't believe in Jesus. But let me just tell you, even if that is true, even if you don't believe anything about God at all, you have to admit that you aren't taking anything with you when you leave. And that even though you may have been born with certain advantages because of where you were born and who your parents were and other different things, you came into the world with nothing and you will go out of it with nothing. And everything you own, here's a newsflash for you, spoiler alert, everything you own is someday going to be owned by somebody else. Come on. The house that you think you own, somebody else someday, unless it burns down or whatever, somebody else is going to live in that house and they're going to say, it's mine. And chances are good that unless you built a new house, somebody else used to live in that house and say it was theirs, right? Everything you own at some point is going to belong to somebody else, which should tell us that, if that's true, then the opposite must also be true, which is that I came into the world with nothing, therefore everything I have has been given to me. And you think, well, no, I've worked hard. I've worked hard for what I have. Can I tell you that if you're living here, if you're listening to this message and you are living in the United States of America, if you were to reverse your circumstance with somebody living in the developing world, it wouldn't matter how hard you worked. It wouldn't matter. You could work twice as hard as the hardest working person in America, and you might still never gain half the wealth that somebody who is born here gets. Listen, everything we have, and this is not to make you feel ashamed or guilty. That's not the point of this. The point of this is to realize that you have been entrusted with a finite treasure for an indefinite period of time. And the way you use that time, the way you use that treasure, it will reveal your loyalty to the king who entrusted you with them. Which brings us to the third and maybe the most disturbing part of this parable. And that is, God's kingdom is coming with mercy and judgment. That the king will come back, and he will be crowned king, and there will be an accounting, and he will come with both mercy and judgment. See, in Jesus' parable, just track this with me for just a second. In Jesus' parable, those who were good stewards of what they'd been given, even if they initially didn't want their master to be king, were still rewarded. Remember, we don't know. Those first two servants who took their mina and doubled it, and he said, okay, you're going to be in charge of 10 cities. You're going to be in charge of 5 cities. We don't really know what they thought about their master. All we know is that they were sending a delegation to say, we don't want him as king. We can just assume that those two didn't want him to be king either. But you know what? They still were good stewards of what he had entrusted to them, even while he was gone, and even when he came back. This reminds us of Zacchaeus. This is the link between the story of Zacchaeus and this parable. Because Zacchaeus was like those two. Zacchaeus rejected God as king. He had abandoned the law of Moses in order to turn a profit from the Roman government. Jesus passes through Jericho, and as he's passing through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, he calls Zacchaeus down from the tree, and he says, hey, I'm coming to your house. I'm going to take an account of what you have. Zacchaeus recognized in that moment, in that instant, he recognized Jesus as king. He surrendered what he had gained by dishonest means, by giving half of it to the poor, by making restitution 4 times what he'd stolen from others. And Jesus says, when he did that, Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house, today. Because Zacchaeus was a 10 mina guy. He was a 10 mina guy. Whatever Zacchaeus thought about Jesus before he climbed the sycamore tree is irrelevant. What is true is that once Jesus called Zacchaeus down out of the tree, Zacchaeus recognized Jesus as Lord and surrendered everything that he'd been trusted with for an indefinite amount of time and said, you are Lord over all of this. I will give half to the poor. I will make restitution to people I've robbed 4 times what I've taken for them. Zacchaeus was a 10 mina guy. See, Jesus' kingdom is coming with mercy. In fact, I always get really uncomfortable when religious people start saying who is in and who is out of the kingdom. It makes me very nervous. Because every time I read the Gospels, Jesus tells the most unlikely people that, yeah, you're in. And the most likely people, yeah, you're out. Right? You're in and you're out. Jesus is coming back, and he is coming back with mercy that goes beyond what we can imagine. And the way we steward what he has given us will determine how he reacts to us, even if in that moment we recognize Jesus as king. There is no such thing as being too late. Jesus is on the cross with a guy who's lived his whole life as a thief and a robber, and he's been executed rightly for his crimes. And he cries out to Jesus for mercy, and Jesus says, today, remember what he said to Zacchaeus, today? He says, today, you will be with me today in paradise. The king is coming, and he is coming with more mercy than you can imagine, but he also comes in judgment. See, afterwards, Jesus continued his trip to Jerusalem. And Jesus knew what was going to happen. He's telling this story. He's on his way to Jerusalem. The religious leaders who rightly had rejected Archelaus as king, remember this crowd? They had all said, we don't want Archelaus as king. They made the tragic mistake of believing that because they'd gotten their way with Archelaus, they could always determine who their king would be. And listen, you may get to vote every 4 years for president, but you do not get to decide who is the king of the universe. You don't. And you may think that you have some modicum of control over your life as the master and commander of your life. Can I tell you, it is all a myth. You are fooling yourself. Because there is a master and a commander, and it is not you. And it is not any public official, federal, state, or local. It's none of those people. All those people are placeholders for the king who is coming. And when he comes with more mercy than you can imagine, but he also comes in judgment. And listen, I know we don't like that. But if you want to be in a kingdom where where there is no more brokenness, there are no more tears, there is no more sorrow, then there has to be judgment Otherwise, all those broken things come with us into the kingdom. You want a king and a judge who says no to the brokenness and to the hurt and to the pain. And in order to have a judge who does that, you have to rely on his mercy to say, I'm not worthy, but because of your mercy and my confidence in you as my Lord, I will gain access. The religious leaders, Jesus is going to go to Jerusalem and they're going to reject him as king. They're going to say, we don't want him as king. He is not our king. In fact, when they go before Pilate, they're going to say to Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. Big mistake, guys. Big mistake. Because Jesus would be crucified and 3 days later the tomb would be empty and Jesus would come back. And do you know that today in Rome, which was the world power, all of those emperors, all of those signs of their power, all of those things have been destroyed, and now most of them became churches, and there are crosses everywhere, because who won in the end? The emperor or Jesus? Jesus won. In fact, today, we don't name our kids Nero and Domitian. We name our dogs Nero. We name our kids Matthew and Mark and Luke, right? I mean, think about this. Think about what the world has seen historically and how Jesus has fulfilled the promise before he's even fully come back. Jesus will sit on the throne, and those who have rejected him will face him as judge. And here's the thing. Here's where it comes to us in our tipping point. That we have to choose what we will do with the resources and the time that God has given us. But you don't get to choose who has ultimate authority over them. You may get to choose what you do with your finite resources and your indefinite amount of time. You may get to choose what you do with it for now, but you do not decide who has ultimate authority over them. And here's the question that we all have to face. Whether you're a believer in Jesus or not, whether you're like Zacchaeus and you've got a history and you've got a bad relationship with religion, or whether you're the crowd who has been waiting on Jesus to come to Jericho all along, we all have to decide who will be our king. Who will be your king? See, this is the great gambit. We all are faced with the same decision those 10 servants had to face. What are we going to do with what God has given us for a limited amount of time? Because what we do with it will determine our loyalty to the king when he returns. Everything we are and all that we have rests on this single decision. I love the way C.S. Lewis put it. There are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without the self-choice, there would be no hell. The question is, who will be your king? Your answer to that question will determine your answer to the next question, which is, what are you doing with the time and possessions he has entrusted to you? What are you doing? And you think, well, I don't have much. I didn't ask you how much you had. I just said, what are you going to do with what he's entrusted to you for the limited amount of time? What are you going to do? Will you hold out what you have as yours, or will you see it as a stewardship entrusted to you by the king who will return? You see, we've all been given an infinite amount of time through all eternity. But in this life, we have a very finite amount of time to decide what we do with a limited amount of treasure. And when King Jesus comes back, what will he find? You and I are the 7 other servants. We will give an account. What will we say? What will King Jesus find? My prayer is that for me, for my family, for our church, that he finds faithful servants who have been diligent to use what he's given us for his kingdom, knowing that when his kingdom comes, we will reign with him forever.